welcome everybody to this session, Travelling for Change, the New Ethical Tourism. My name's Peter Smith and I run the tourism programmes at St Mary's University in Twickenham. I'm your chair for this session today. And just very quickly, a couple of words of introduction. Every year, thousands of young people take time out to have the adventure and to try and make a difference through serving causes that they hold dear. Volunteer tourism, and probably more recognised, the gap year projects, are a staple feature now of university and further education life, and are quite frequently featured in travel broadsheets, travel magazines, and other publications that we will be familiar with. It's no real exaggeration to say, in many sectors of society, the gap year has taken on a rites of passage, as ambitious people with altruistic intent try to make a difference in the world. The questions we want to ask today are how far these concerns and how far ethical tourists actually help development in the global south. To discuss this, our panel is Jim Butcher. Jim is Reader in Geography of Tourism at Canterbury Christ Church University, the author of a number of books and one of the academics' most critical voices of tourism's ethical turn. Second to speak will be Harold Goodwin, Professor of Responsible Tourism at Manchester Metropolitan University, Founding Director of the International Centre for Responsible Tourism, and I think one of the world's leading academics in this field. And then thirdly is Anna Madej, Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, a visiting professor at Mazumbe University in Tanzania, and author of Politics in Africa, A New Introduction, and unlike Harold, combines an academic career with an advocacy and campaigning focus. Just very quickly, the session today, each speaker will speak for 5 minutes. I'm very keen to go straight out to the audience to get questions and points. One of the things that I'm aware of is that we've probably all been tourists at some stage, or we've all travelled, and it's the type of subject that we all like to comment on. So if you could get your thoughts together as the speakers are introducing their thoughts, and maybe ask some questions and points from the floor. I do have to have a quick statement of my own personal interest in the impartiality. I'm the co-author of a book on volunteer tourism with Jim, but I'll aim to be impartial in my chairing. And Harold taught me at London Metropolitan University on an MA in the early 2000s, and he was always a very inspiring and inspirational teacher, but I will make sure that I don't give you an easy ride today. So there's my statement of interest. Okay, thank you. Jim.
When I first went on holiday abroad as in my late teens with friends in the mid-1980s, I don't think it occurred to any of us or any of my peers that holidays were anything other than about leaving your cares behind. That was the purpose of a holiday. You left the stresses and strains of life at home behind and you had a very, very good time. Maybe you went in search of inspiration, a bit of education, but it wasn't something that was really connected to one's broader ethical, social, or even political priorities. It didn't occur to people. I think if people had come up to us and talked about ethical tourism and so on, we wouldn't really have registered what that meant, and it wasn't that long ago, even though I notice all the people on the panel here are decidedly older than everybody in the audience, so perhaps you can enlighten us on some of on what's happening today. By the 1980s, various niches, most conspicuously ecotourism, had kind of emerged beyond being market niches to actually become markers of moral intent. If you were this kind of tourist, if you engaged in this kind of holiday, you were trying to act upon the world, conservation, community, development, and so on. So this is kind of quite a notable change, really. A conspicuous part of lifestyle, effectively, holidays, becomes associated with acting upon the world, being a kind of one's agency, if you like. Most conspicuous was ecotourism, based around the idea that on your holidays, you experience the natural world, but also help to conserve it, and also aid people living rural lives, normally in the developing world, who live cheek by jowl with the nature that you've come to appreciate. So you've got a very kind of particular, if you like, political ethical philosophy being put forward as ethical tourism, a kind of universal, normative, good thing for all tourists to aspire for. At the same time, in my first book, I noted that a lot of kind of criticisms of mass tourism, even in books at university and college that students would read. So, for example, a very popular marketing textbook has the following to say about mass package tourism. Crisis of mass tourism has brought social, cultural, economic havoc in its wake. Mass tourism must be radically changed to bring in the new. So you have this whole kind of idea of the need for new ethical niches for people to engage in those, think about those, to basically clean up a dirty industry where people were not paying sufficient attention to the cultures and the environments they were visiting. Now that's developed on again into the 2000s. We have a situation that I sometimes refer to as prefixation. You can't talk about tourism anymore, it needs a prefix. And lots of prefixes have been put forward by the marketing people, by the geographers, by the academics, by the NGOs. So people criticised ecotourism maybe for its environmental focus at the expense of communities. So you put a new prefix on the beginning, community tourism or responsible tourism. And we have others as well, philanthropy tourism, and perhaps the most recent and most prominent, certainly in the broadsheets, has been this discussion of volunteer tourism, which really is the kind of endpoint of ethical tourism, because this is a holiday, not where you try to help people in environments as a byproduct of your holiday, but actually it's the purpose of the holiday itself. It's a very kind of central role of what you seek to do. You work with local people on rural development projects, conservation initiatives, and so on. So that's what we have, prefixation. It's very mainstream. Somebody sent me a link the other day to something called Fathom Cruises. Now, I always thought cruises were the kind of epitome of luxury travel, but Fathom Cruises say, before anything else on their webpage, their cruises combine your love of travel with your desire to make a difference. And then they go on to say how when you step off the luxury of the boat onto land, they'll fix you up to work on sustainable initiatives. They're always sustainable initiatives, and that's a very central part of the trip. So it's kind of quite mainstream, it's sort of seeped out of the niche, if you like, right across mainstream tourism in many ways. Now, these niches are travelling with a mission. They do claim to make a difference. They are linked to narratives of development, and Anna and will know a lot more about that than I do. They're also strongly linked to the idea of global citizenship. If you go on these kind of trips, experience other cultures, other ways of life, and get involved in helping people, this is, if you like, a passport to global citizenship, something that you can put in your CV, but also something that will help to transform your identity into a kind of global citizen and a knowing person. Now, that's how things have progressed. It seems to me very much what's happening here is a replacement. If people are looking at holidays as a way to change the world, they're replacing public politics with private action, normally through consumption. So that's a very kind of notable sort of change from the periods before that. The other thing that's really notable is the replacement of a kind of political discourse about development and what is needed in rural parts of the developing world with one that's very much framed through emotion. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the blogs of people who go as volunteer tourists. They always invariably focus on little vignettes, little stories that have come from their visits. Often that involves a child in the developing world. So you can kind of see that emotion here is not just the way people are responding to the problems they perceive in other countries, but it's also the kind of frame of reference through which they actually act. And that might be something that you want to comment on. Very finally and briefly, to stay within the time, I want to end up by making a slightly different point, really, which is that ethical tourism, in the ethical tourism lobby, is interminably self-critical. One new ethical niche comes along, and you can guarantee within a year or two, other people will be criticising it and proposing something different. It has that kind of circular character to it. Ecotourism came along in the 90s, and then people said, too much nature, not enough environment, and so the debate goes on. Volunteer tourism comes along. Young people can help in developing countries and so on. And almost immediately, those people are accused of being naïve, white and middle class. That's a big insult, by the way. Also, they're accused of being carriers of colonialism and conduits for consumerism. Demos, the think tank in Britain in 2012, wrote a report on this, and they said there is a risk that such programmes, volunteer tourism, perpetuate stereotypes of Western colonialism, a new way for the West to assert its power. So I'm sure some of the young people who went travelling never realised that they were conduits for a kind of new form of liberal colonialism. And I think this is a real problem, because what we then have is a kind of moral etiquette and angst in relation to what should be free, open-ended, and exploratory, if you like, travel. And I think, to conclude, I think there is a relationship between holidays and travelling and ethics and moral behaviour. there is a link, but it's completely the opposite one that the ethical Tory lobby make. The link is simply this, that through travel, through engaging in exciting, experimental, open-ended activity, we force ourselves to address the issue of moral autonomy. We decide, we encounter difference, we decide, we think, it forces us to think. And it seems to me all the ethical tourism lobby really do is establish an etiquette that kind of bypasses that very creative and important process of young people developing moral autonomy through new experiences and encountering things sort of full on, if you like, and always trying to have us mediate those things through this kind of deference to cultural difference, deference to environmental concerns. And I just think that travel should be much more open-ended in that kind of sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Okay, Harold.
I think one of the reasons I was invited to be on the panel was to try and create some controversy, but I think this is a difficult topic for us as a panel to have controversy about because we agree about a lot of it. But to pick up on a couple of things to start with, I abandoned any notion of ethical tourism way back in the late 1990s, pretty much actually for the reasons that Jim has just outlined, and that's why I focused on responsibility and challenging people to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. I didn't travel abroad very much. I chose to have a career which didn't pay very well for quite a long time, and the only way I could travel was by getting groups of adult students to travel with me, and I travelled as a tour leader. I became increasingly angry in the 1980s, particularly, at the growth of ecotourism and that awful slogan, take only photographs, leave only footprints. Because as far as I can see, that's an entirely exploitative idea. I will come along and enjoy this bit of pristine nature that you've left and not developed for your own benefit. I'll come along and use it for free and I'll leave no money behind. So my concern about ecotourism from the very beginning wasn't about whether it dealt with conservation or communities. It was simply straightforwardly fakery, that there was no context in which you could understand ecotourism as being superior to any other kind of tourism, except from the point of view of the consumer. It made no difference for conservation, and it made no difference for local communities. Jim, you mentioned Fathom cruises. This is a really interesting example because one of the reasons that Fathom cruises, I believe, has been so successful is that people who are volunteering in the States can often make that trip tax deductible. So now what we have is a form of travel where potentially, I'm not saying everybody will do this, or indeed even that that's the intention because we're on video, but it is the case that people can in the States get tax deductible rights as a consequence of travelling to make the world a better place through doing sustainable tourism projects. And I'd be very interested to see how that develops, but I'm quite suspicious that that may be where it's going. I run a Masters in Responsible Tourism. I campaign for responsible tourism. We run annual conferences all around the world on what responsible tourism would mean in destinations. Since 2000, we've been campaigning since 2004, we've been campaigning at WTM for responsible tourism, which is one of the world's biggest travel shows. And a lot of my time is spent with the industry. What is interesting on the volunteering side is that we've got the British Standards Institute and ABTA both coming out with guidelines in the near future on what would make tourism and volunteering tourism more responsible. The responsible tourism agenda is very wide, and I'm not going to talk about it extensively here, but except to say that tourism isn't a natural phenomenon. It is what we do, and we change tourism by the way in which we travel. Both the way we travel as consumers, but also the way in which we provide those services if we're in the industry. So it is a social product. You create tourism by the choices that you make when you travel. It's what we make it, it is a consequence of the choices we make. And it's a question really of whether you want to travel responsibly or irresponsibly. And my experience is that most people don't want to be accused of being irresponsible. They want to find ways in which their travel is responsible, and we might come back to that. I should declare an interest, but I'm a non-executive chair of a volunteering company, which is why I think I might be here, try and create some controversy. It's a company called People and Places. It's run by my wife and a friend of hers. And I can say with absolute confidence that volunteering is not just something that young people do. Most of the people that we carry are my age. Some of them a lot older, some of them a lot younger. There's a complete range of people doing it. I'd also say that implicit in the idea of responsible tourism is that constant challenge. Are you being responsible or are you not? And what we've done with People and Places is to create what we believe is the world's most responsible volunteering company. Now, people will often query that, but the point that we make is that by making that assertion and then checking our practice against what everybody else is doing, we're constantly forced to improve. We can't just sit back and claim that without constantly improving the way in which we operate. It's a not-for-profit, but let me give you an example of the kind of problems we have. This is from Kate, my wife, just in the last week. She's just received an email from somebody who says this, and I can't do it in a female American accent, which is probably what's required, so I'll just read it to you. Hi, I'm looking for a volunteer getaway over the Christmas holiday this year, ideally around 1 week's duration, leave before December 25th. Any ideas? Now, Kate's immediate idea was to respond to that with an Anglo-Saxon vernacular, but she didn't. The problem is that people's expectation of what they can do is massively above what they can conceivably achieve in practice. And the question you have to ask yourself, I think, is, are you volunteering as a citizen or are you volunteering as a consumer? Are you a citizen who would volunteer at home? Are you a consumer looking to do something more interesting in your holiday? And perhaps the most extreme example that I've come across was from a UK company which contacted one of the people we work with in Kerala, asking whether they could bring a group of tourists at the end of their trip to visit the village, and could they distribute bread. So this is a one-off, hour-long excursion at the end of a trip to make it a volunteering trip, normal holiday to Kerala, distribute bread, and of course not even noticing that people don't eat bread in Kerala. It's actually a rice-based economy. I mean, it just breaks every single rule in the book, and that does still go on. There's a whole series of issues around volunteering which we can maybe get to about child protection, about people being sacked in destinations to make spaces for volunteers. But the fundamental point I'd like to end with is that volunteering abroad isn't inherently bad. It's about the way we do it. And the reason we set up People and Places was to do it in a more responsible way and to demonstrate that it can be done well, and that if it's done well, it brings benefits both to the communities where the volunteering takes place and to the volunteers themselves.
Thank you very much. Bang on 7 minutes. Perfect. Thank you. Anna.
I'd like to respond to this on two dimensions. Firstly, from my own personal experience of volunteering. I'm not a tourism academic, I'm an international development academic, and recently moved into the policy world. So I'll come back to the whole development side and the contribution of volunteering and volunteer tourism to development a bit later. But how people get into international development these days is often through volunteer tourism. And when I went into international development as a young research assistant 14, 15 years ago, all my colleagues had gone straight from university into VSO or working on government schemes, where they got 2 years abroad, structured volunteering places, and then they were able to go into the industry. Well, those routes have very often closed up now, and so volunteer tourism, for me, was my way to get out into the world, see a little bit of depth in places where I went. I'd never heard of Tanzania, where I went as a 19-year-old, before I found the leaflet. I can't even remember where I found the leaflet. Let's go to this country, never been on an aeroplane. Went, the aeroplane doors opened, and I could feel the humidity. And driving on that lorry through the streets of Dar es Salaam, seeing little fires on the roadside, suddenly thinking, wow, this is the world opened up. And so I have very mixed feelings about volunteer tourism. I think there are lots of bad things that have happened underneath this title, but at the same time, I am quite a passionate believer in the transformation that it can bring into individuals' lives. Now, that might be that you went looking for volunteer tourism as a career path, as a step on your CV. Might have been a little part of your holiday, but it can be transformational. And I think it's that we want to hang on to in what's good about it. As a contribution to development, that's a whole other question. And I think one trend that I've seen in volunteer tourism is an attempt to change tourist organisations into development organisations. And I think that is a little bit problematic. development is a hard political business. It's an industry in its own right that's now been growing, morphing in different ways, at least the last 50, 60 years. So it's rather naive of small NGOs, non-profit organisations, the big businesses to come into that space and think that they can then make easy win contributions to development as a whole. And so the problems of volunteer tourism can also be seen in the problems of development as well, because they're fundamental problems about going to work in other places, and we're working in resource-poor environments that may have poor governance structures, poor civil society structures, lack of functioning bureaucracy. So the problems of the small projects that we go to work at as tourists are bigger problems of how development itself works and how development organisations work more broadly. And so I think if volunteer tourism and organisations want to slightly reinvent themselves, they need to look very carefully at some of these debates in development as well. I was recently living in Morogoro in Tanzania. It's mentioned that I'm a visiting professor at Mzumbe University in Tanzania. And Rally International are based there in Tanzania. And they're an organisation who have transformed themselves from a volunteer travel organisation, young people, it's not for profit, adventures, I think originally they started, into trying to be a development organisation, but using volunteers as a model. Now that has still all the problems of volunteer tourism. It's bringing people who aren't skilled in that environment, in that context, for very short spaces of time and expecting that they can make an impact locally. Well, I'll tell you for certain that they don't. Those projects do not make an impact on development. They create artifacts in the local environment, in the local space that make burdens to the local community, that often disable local efforts in civil society and local organisations to organise themselves. So I think we've got a problem here. A lot of development organisations themselves, even some of our very big international non-governmental organisations, actually cause harm by the projects that they bring to local communities, because they bring in a lot of money very often. And lots of money it may be a very small amount of money to us, but they can bring it into environments that are very resource poor, and they create enormous disruptions in terms of, say, local government trying to manage the efforts that they're doing. So if you think about Tanzania, Tanzania is a place that has many, many organisations coming in, volunteer tourist organisations, small development organisations, somebody who just got off a plane and thought they had a bit of money, they'd like to come and start a school. And your local government officer has to manage all of those projects. And they can't. They haven't got the capacity to do it. They may not even have transport to go around all the different places these organisations are working. And because these organisations bring in money, and because they feel that they've come on a mission to help, they feel that they've got rights to be there and rights to tell people what to do locally. So I think that we need to be very careful in how we volunteer. We need to think about really what skills we've got as organisations and individuals. And we need to think about building relationships in the places that we go, building long-term relationships so that we move beyond the tourism as consumer experience to building human relationships with people and the places that you meet there. And those over the long term can be transformational.
We're going to go straight to the floor with points and questions. It would be very interesting to hear, actually, if anybody has been a volunteer tourist, and perhaps a little bit, very briefly, of their experiences of that.
I find it interesting that the feeling towards tourists on this panel is fairly negative and looking at tourists as a consumer. But I think in many cases, especially when you think about young people going to volunteer and with good intentions to help, it's also a search of sort of culture and knowledge. And I think in a way, you're blaming people because they're ignorant of what's happening in other cultures and trying to help in ways that they just don't understand at all. So it's just a shame that there is a lot of good intentions, but they're not used in the best way. When they really could be, because there's a lot of resources. And maybe it's the way that we're looking at tourists and thinking they're consumers, they're for their own benefit. But as much as people have a right to protect their homeland and, the way they live, people also have a right to see the world and to learn more about different cultures. And you're right, it could be done very differently so that, those are separate things. But it's just the attitude that we're looking at it at this moment. It's just something that's particularly interesting. And I just wondered if that's something that's really fully thought about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's actually a really, really good point about the panel possibly being too negative about the aspirations of people to want to see the world to do this. It's an excellent point. Thank you.
So here's a question maybe for Mr. Goodwin. So you're a professor of responsible tourism, I believe.
Yeah.
So what is irresponsible tourism then? And maybe to Mr. Butcher, do you agree that about the definitions of ecotourism and voluntourism and responsible tourism being something different from ecotourism? Apparently ecotourism is bad, but responsible tourism is good.
Harold, do you want to go?
Well, perhaps I should take up the attitude to tourism question, because clearly I wouldn't be spending any part of my life chairing a company which sends people to volunteer abroad if I didn't think it was a good thing. I do think it's a good thing, and I think a lot of people who go to volunteer abroad do achieve things. To some extent, I agree with Anna. I think a lot of it is very bad, but there is some good. And the challenge in life is to increase the number of good examples and reduce the number of bad examples. It's as simple as that, really. One thing I would say is that one of the things that worries me most is where particularly young people build their CVs by going abroad to volunteer to do things which they would not be allowed to do in the UK. And we often say to the people who want to volunteer with us, if you wouldn't be allowed to go into a school and do that in the UK, why do you think it's okay to do it in Tanzania or the Gambia or wherever else? And it's the same with a lot of medical students now, apparently, are going off to volunteer and get medical experience abroad to impress the universities, build their CVs. And they're doing things in terms of standing in operations, being in the theatre, all gowned up, which they certainly would not be allowed to do in the UK. And I think that's an area where universities have got a responsibility to say we're just not impressed by that kind of behaviour. So it isn't just about the young people. And I absolutely think that volunteering abroad is a great thing for young people to do. The first volunteers I ever saw abroad, though, were working, I forget with which of the big ones, but it was one of the big volunteering companies, and they were digging holes in the ground in Wangi Nature Reserve to create watering points for elephants, which I thought was a great way of punishing the young people. I don't know what they'd done, but clearly they deserved to be punished if they were doing that. But of course, the other side of that is that was denying an income for local people who've been very pleased to be paid to dig holes in the ground. So I think there's just a lot of bad practice. I'll maybe not answer the second question until Jim has...
Okay, yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Jim?
Very much agree with the first comment about the problematisation of travel. I mean, this is people moving around, experiencing new things. What's not to like? It seems to me historically the extension of people's ability to travel for education, for leisure, to meet relatives is an entirely, it's almost like a kind of mirror of the kind of progress, economic and social progress that societies have seen. And my argument really is precisely to deproblematise these things, to approach them with a great deal more optimism. Optimism in the capacity of young people, human beings generally, to negotiate new intercultural and social experiences. Without a handbook of do's and don'ts, metaphorical or real, and there are some real ones around, about how you should do it, where you should volunteer, how you should respect the local culture and customs and things like that. So, I mean, another part of that, of course, is in answer to this, moving on to the second question, what's irresponsible? Well, there's a very, very, very clear sense from geography courses like I teach on, universities, companies, NGOs, that mass tourism, package holidays, people who travel without this kind of moral baggage, they are irresponsible. And Harold might say he agrees with me, but he spent the last 2 decades building up companies and NGOs and awards based on the idea of this is responsible, almost invariably small-scale rural projects. And by implication, these are the things that don't kind of respect that kind of deference to local culture are irresponsible. That's what I mean by kind of etiquette. Now, we have our differences on development. I mean, I dare say Anna and I and people in the audience would have different views of what is good or bad development. Precisely the point, in a sense, of stripping away the etiquette around lifestyle is to facilitate a situation where people encounter the world without prior moral viewpoint that proposes itself as a normative sort of value for all. The clearest example of that is something like ecotourism, which everybody, Harold and everybody else used to advocate. It now wants to distance
That's
itself.
not true, Jim. I never advocated ecotourism.
But I mean, the point is that ecotourism is premised upon the idea of a kind of symbiosis between communities and the natural world. So, tourists come, people get some money, and the natural community is supported. There's kind of an incentivisation of conservation in that sort of situation. This is what is regarded as responsible. But actually, what that whole way of looking at development is actually saying is rural communities can have some development, but only within the limits of their current, present relationship with the environment. And this is a very, very important thing to note, because the idea of development as transformative of a community, of a society, of way of life, of economy, is generally regarded as very problematic and irresponsible. And I think that's, in terms of the development discussion, and I think some of the points Anna made were right on this, that we kind of need to separate out, I think, holidays from a discussion of development. It's absolutely right, but they are being brought together here. This is the way that people see that they can act upon the world, and it's very, very important to challenge that presentism and argue for something much better.
First of all, we do actually in the awards, Jim, give awards to TUI, which makes people, not you, but other people very angry. Because my view is that any form of tourism can be more responsible or less responsible. The people flying away on ecotourism holidays are flying in the same planes as other people. They're in no way morally superior. And what annoys me is that claim of moral superiority for some kinds of holidays. I'm actually in favour of all-inclusive resorts if they're delivering for local communities. And some do, and some don't. The world is a complicated place, and people need to be challenged to think about the consequences of the choices that they make, whether that's mass tourism or ecotourism.
Okay, very good point. Anna?
I agree with that. And actually, I think sometimes it might be better to go back to tourism as the business and how the business is responsible, its social, economic responsibilities. I've organised volunteer tourism in my husband's village in Tanzania. And what has made the biggest difference is money going to the local economy and employing people in the local economy. It's not the skills of the volunteers. And I don't want to be negative about volunteers, I don't at all. And from having personally experienced volunteer placements, you get some fantastic volunteers who come very sensitive to local culture, want to learn and do some great things. On the other hand, a bigger problem appears to be development, not just tourism as consumption, but development almost as consumption. And I think that we have a slight development propaganda that goes on in this country. And DFID government actually put money into this and fund different schemes that actually promote an idea that development's easy. We give a little bit of aid, we change some governance relationships, we put in some projects, and things are different. Wow, we've met the Millennium Development Goals. But it's much, much more complicated than that. And even in the development industry, it's a lot of agonising about really what makes a difference and have things really changed on the ground. And I think so it's no surprise then that young people come with this belief that it's easy. I'll just come and help with a few skills. And things like comic relief as our entry point, as our sort of mass media consumption of development, promote many myths about how development works. And so it's unsurprising, I think, then, that young people do come with a lot of those myths and stereotypes about how easy it is to change things.
I agree with the point made earlier about the experience being transformational, but I think it also gives young people an unrealistic sense of what development actually is. I mean, I myself, I did the whole gap year thing. I went over to India, I taught out in a school, and I had an amazing experience. And so I decided that the only thing I wanted to do in my life was international development. I ended up in an office in Geneva, which was completely different to my experience prior to that. And I think a lot of young people go into it and they don't really understand what development actually means. And I think also the issue that I have with some of the comments that have been made was that the path to hell is paved with the soles of the good intentions. I don't think good intentions necessarily mean anything on the development scheme of things. I think the important thing is actually not to be paternalistic when we do these things. I think a lot of these development organisations are created by us in the West, and we don't, like, we're good intention when we create these things up, but it's involving, as you've said, entirely involving the local communities and making sure that actually they are responsible for their own development, and not that we're responsible for their development. We're not. We can be involved in it, we can assist in that, but we cannot be responsible for that, because when we've been responsible for that in the past, we've created more harm than good. I think the important thing is that they are responsible for that.
Thank you very much. I know I'm supposed to be impartial, but I think you touched on something very, very interesting. I sit around reading academic papers largely through tourism and human geography. Every single paper always deals with a very small example of development. So development has become redefined. It's always about a small, relatively isolated community, living cheek by jowl, and how the impacts can be. So I think, slightly in echoing your point, is in many ways it's development itself that has been redefined, and the tourism slightly comes separately, which is what Anna was saying. Anyway, that's just my thoughts, just to add to it. So there's another question, there's another hand down the front here somewhere.
The perception of ecotourism is quite hard because sometimes it can be quite expensive just to get there in itself. And therefore you have a very specific group of people with disposable income that tend to go on these holidays. And I think that perpetuates the idea that everyone's white and middle class and doing it for that reason, because actually it's not accessible to all. Mm-hmm. My second point is that I don't think you need to be responsible tourism doesn't need to all be about eco-volunteering. It could be just small choices you make. So if you're staying in a hotel, what do that hotel do in its community, even if it's a big corporate? Do they work in their communities? Are they working within their workforce around kind of issues of human trafficking, which is a big issue in the tourism industry, and just how you get there as well? I think you can make tiny choices in a normal holiday to be more responsible.
Okay.
When I was in Kenya, I gave my passport to the security guy on the reception of this orphanage. I was able to go in and spend an hour playing with and feeding the kids. If I did that here, went to a nursery in this country and said I've come to feed the kids at lunchtime, we know what would happen. All right. The guy that took me up Kilimanjaro had a torch around his neck with a piece of string. If you did that in this country, there would be murder. Now, I left him my head torch thing. Now, thinking about it, that's a good thing, isn't it? What afterwards happens when he has to get new batteries for the head torch? So that's my point. But also, who decides whether I'm morally right or wrong? Because it feels like we are deciding all these things here for people in other countries, which is what it's always been, isn't it?
Okay, very, very good point, actually.
Hi, I had 2 quick points. So first of all, that it may be worth separating tourism from development here, because we're kind of mixing up the two. So on development, in response to your comment, that there is no definition of development, so there's no one thing that this is development. There are NGOs that do very different things to the organizations based in Geneva, that's true, but which one is the correct thing or what should be done, that's open to debate. There's no one particular thing. And people who do get into development, well, I'm speaking as someone who actually studies that and works in that area, you can yourself shape and define what you think development should be, say. And on tourism as well, especially responsible and ecotourism, the impression I'm getting is that there's almost a consensus that you should leave money behind, which in a sense would restrict poor people, or people who are not very well off in the Western world, from traveling and having the same experiences, finding out about other communities and getting involved there. So this idea that if you don't, you have to leave money behind, it can't just be footprints, maybe those that are less well off, who still want to travel, maybe they're trying to do some good in another way. Is it possible for them to also contribute in a different way other than financially?
Thank you.
I'll just come back on that final point, really, with 3 very short anecdotes. One was about what happened to people who were running perfectly good little cabins for backpackers in the Philippines. They went out of business because backpackers increasingly want private facilities in their cabins for the same price that they expect to pay, or previously paid without private facilities. So, I mean, that's a myth. From Indonesia, tourists, backpackers who would come through and demand a homestay and a chicken, and wouldn't stay unless the chicken got thrown in for free. So the community lost its chickens. They never argued about the price of a cold beer in the hotel. That was fine. They'd always pay for that. And the third example is a story that was told to us by one of the communities we work with, of the chief in the next village, saying, do you know this guy who runs one of the big companies? Please tell him not to send us any more volunteers. Our community has no chickens left. I mean, we cannot walk away from the responsibility of those consequences of our actions. And in the end, these issues, to your point about Kenya, these issues are incredibly complicated, but we need to think them through and take responsibility for the decisions we make and accept that we should be challenged about those decisions. But there are no easy answers to these questions.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Well, there aren't any easy answers, and I think more the point is that trying to address ethical and moral responsibilities through the consumption of holidays is a non-starter, basically. I mean, we can worry about it all we like, and we can debate what I do, what you do, how we buy, where we stay. It doesn't amount to a line of beans, frankly. I mean, it's very, very easy to get your head around this. I mean, if you're on holiday and somebody's selling a coral necklace on the beach, what do? You buy it to help the guy's family and you destroy the coral reef, or you don't buy it to save the coral reef and the guy's family doesn't eat. The fact is, consumption and lifestyle and holidays is a very attenuated realm in which to exercise our moral credentials. And that's why I'm kind of suggesting that lifestyle needs to be put to one side as lifestyle, and we need to look beyond individual, emotional, lifestyle-oriented responses to tackle big things like development. I have to say, development thinking itself has done a lot of the damage here. Mainstream development thinkers, I mean, Robert Chambers, the guru of rural development, is, if you read his books, putting the last first and putting the first last, there's so much in there about how development work, never mind tourism, development work is all about relating to people, forging relationships, having fun, being playful. You read this stuff and you think this might as well be tourism, frankly. And therefore, okay, it's a bit of an assertion, but when we come to development, we have to think well beyond, these kind of localised sorts of projects that are often lauded as ethical tourism. And by default, things that can really make a difference, things that transformed the Spanish economy, mass tourism, are regarded as concrete jungles, unethical, and not for people in the developing world. And I think that's really, really important, just in relation to the last point. People here deciding what is good there, there is a kind of moralistic assertion that sustainable, small-scale developments are what people over there would favour. And I think we just want to open that up. Let tourists travel freely and decide for themselves.
Okay. Anna?
I mean, I think I would agree there, actually. And yes, I mean, this was my problem with ethical tourism, I've forgotten what we're calling it now. Volunteer tourism trying to reinvent itself as development, is that development itself was very damaging. And yes, that sort of PRA, Robert Chambers' participatory rural appraisal, has been accused of being development tourism. But much of what people do in development is also tourism. I've just been on a nice workshop in Bangkok this last week. And that felt a little bit, that we, development professionals, we fly around the world and we go to nice hotels in capital cities and we have a nice workshop together and then we go home again. And that's just a different level of tourism. It's not volunteering. I was there as a volunteer, but it's now then professional international development tourism. Academics do it as well. We're always flying around the world to different events, things like that, taking our students around the world, the same sort of travel. And we tell ourselves it's part of a greater good, part of a sort of development end point. But the industry itself is at war within itself anyway. I mean, the whole debates about the Sustainable Development Goals are around agonising over really what do we want? What are moral and ethical choices? What sort of economies do we want? Do we want economic growth at all costs, or do we want economic growth that actually favours the least well-off in society? And that is where some of the small, that's why I was saying I quite favour this route towards business rather than non-profit. Properly constituted sustainable tourism businesses that put money into local economies could be much better for development than many, many, many small non-governmental organisations trying to run around doing the same sorts of things and fundraising from the same sources and propagating the development myth could be much more damaging. Although that would seem a counterintuitive way of looking at it.
So a new way of looking at what actually development means, and then business feeding into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we say, and the point was made down here, that development is such a broad undertaking.
Okay.
The community-driven development has somewhat gone out of fashion, actually, in development circles. There was a whole move to invest in governments and just give government-to-government funding.
Okay, thank you. Without sounding facetious, and this is something to think about, we have over here the small things potentially make a difference and you've added them up. And over here we've got the macro solutions, and in the middle we seem to have the small things are too small, are the macro things
But I'm saying
too
that
big?
the small things can contribute. The small things can put money in the local economy, because often the problem with the mass tourism in developing countries where it's happened is that you get a leak capture of the benefits. So poor people lose their land very easily. We see it all over East Africa and many places. The eco-tourism, that's where I went to do eco-tourism. We were surveying the coral reefs on Mafia Island in Tanzania to make a World Wildlife Fund park. And now recent research comes out and says that's part of a new, what they're calling blue grabbing, where then conservation organisations can dispossess local people of the land through saying it's now going to be sustainably used as tourism. So that it then disempowers the local community because the governance isn't there in those countries to share the benefits of that economic investment.
Very good.
So I don't think there's one solution.
Very good, but I think both of you have looked at that. I think there's an example.
All tourism benefits countries and poorer countries generally, because revenue comes in, there's profits that can be attributed to build infrastructure and so on and so forth. The other observation, which I thought was going to come up today, but it hasn't, is that the sort of young people that go now on gap year trips have to be quite well off. Their families have to have quite a lot of disposable money, because after all, university fees have now gone up to 9,000. So there is a little bit of a white, maybe better off class that go abroad. But young people can contribute in other ways than just going on eco projects. And quite a striking example of that, I actually work as a travel writer, as a feature writer and photographer, is I was in Lithuania, and there were two guys running very late for the plane. And they didn't look like they'd been on a stag party, like a lot of people, as we all know, go to places like Vilnius. And I said, well, what are you guys doing? And they said, we're sports management graduates from Birmingham University. And I said, what brings you here? And they said, we are the golf professionals at the new golf courses that were being built there. And I just thought that was a wonderful example of positive young people, not just getting boozed up. And also, a thing that particularly appealed to me is that a lot of people are a bit sneery about things like media studies at university and all of those sort of things. And when I said to my daughter, who was at Birmingham University, two people from sports management there, she said they're a real load of layabouts. And I just thought that was marvellous in a conceptual point of view.
Great, thank you. And then
just coming back to what the lady over there said about good intentions. When I was 17, I went to Ghana for a few months to volunteer, and I certainly had good intentions. But looking back now, I'm just kind of mortified about the whole thing, because I think coming from a position of privilege, I had a responsibility to educate myself, and I didn't. And instead, I went and probably contributed to kind of perpetuation of a kind of white savior complex, probably contributed to actual economic harm to the community I was living in. And I was just wondering if you think there is actually a way to kind of channel those good intentions into something positive?
Excellent question. Try not to feel too bad about it. But I think that is a really, really excellent question, because I think one of the things that there's a danger of is not meeting that idea of young people who actually do want to go out into the world and do something good. And I think there is a danger that the criticisms and variety on the panel and elsewhere perhaps sort of perpetuate that. I think that's a really, really good point. We really don't have much time, I'm afraid. So if I could go back to the panel in the reverse order, to be fair.
I mean, we've always covered so much in this sort of debate about this, because we're going from the level of personal responsibility up to macroeconomic development. And so, of course, as an individual, we can't worry about macroeconomic development because we can't do a lot about that as an individual. We can only be responsible for what we do as an individual. And so I think, you raised some good points. You've obviously agonised about your own trip. And I think but that's what we all often end up doing, because we may go with naive assumptions, but actually actually the value of the travel and the immersion of being there makes you face up to all sorts of difficult questions about the society you come from and about this new society that you're experiencing. For me, I've agonised a long time over this interaction about guilt, about what should I do differently, how should I make a contribution. And I don't think there's a right answer, but we just have to keep asking ourselves. And I think it's about making long-term relationships with people in the places where you're going. I don't mean taking it to extreme. I got married in the village where I'd, visited, but you don't have to go to that extreme. But I mean, it's about those human contacts and human relationships, about bridging gaps between worlds, and thinking about that, yes, if you've got the power to travel from here to somewhere else, likely most people there wouldn't ever be able to travel in the other direction. And you do have a lot of money compared to them, a lot of money and power. However poor you feel as a young student, you're probably far better off than everybody who's living around you. And so you can make small contributions. You can help people put kids through school. But I'm not saying you start doing that in a sort of patronage way. I'm saying that you make relationships, you make friends, and you help your friends as well. And it's about shared understandings and shared human relationships.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Harold.
Thanks. Let me start by agreeing with Anna. I think that there's an enormous opportunity for people to volunteer abroad, and I think if it's done well, it does good in the world. I wouldn't spend as much time as I do on volunteer tourism if I didn't believe that that was true. So let me be really clear about that. It is a valuable thing to do, and if done well, it can do good things. The second thing I'd like to say is that responsible tourism is about trying to make all forms of tourism more responsible and to challenge people to think about the consequences, whether that's a big all-inclusive resort in Spain or in Zanzibar. The same issues apply to big companies and small. And the notion that only small companies can be responsible is simply false. And that's true of the awards. Just look at who we've given awards to. Many of them have been very big companies. The challenge is to change the way the industry works. And the third thing I'd like to say is that I don't think we can just allow people to go away and do whatever they like on holiday. Because if we're going to do that, then we might as well not suggest that it's wrong to go and have sex with children when you're away on holiday. It is clearly wrong to do that. And we spend a lot of time working with the industry to help them to stop it happening. It's not that they cause it to happen, but they sometimes facilitate it because people use the facilities that they provide. Volunteering companies have been used to facilitate sexual exploitation of children. We can't just say that people are on holiday, they should have a good time. We have to take responsibility for that. But I do agree with Jim that it isn't enough just to look at it in terms of consumption. We're all consumers and we're all citizens. In my view, over the last 40 years, far too much emphasis on what can be achieved by consumers, but that's because as citizens we've become disempowered. And you only need to look at the other debates happening in the building today to see that that debate about the role of politics in this is happening in other places, and I'd encourage you to go to those debates.
Great, thank you. Jim.
It's an interesting point there about citizenship, given that volunteer tourism is so closely linked to global citizenship. I think there's a real kind of sense sometimes that citizenship's in crisis at home, and people are looking, there's this sense of acquiring citizenship through moral missions abroad. And I think that's kind of misplaced, because as citizens, where power lies and where we can act as citizens democratically is at home. That doesn't mean we disregard issues all around the world, but there is a kind of sense of that kind of outsourcing of citizenship going on. A friend of mine did a study in Mozambique in a village, and he found a very interesting thing. He found that the people in this village, Canhain, I can't remember exactly what it was called now, he found that the local villagers regarded the development workers as tourists, because the development workers stayed in big hotels and spent lots of money, and they benefited. And they regarded the tourists as development workers, but useless ones, because the tourists came along, were scared to spend money for fear of spreading Western scourge of consumerism, and felt incredibly guilty. So they kind of regarded them as these sort of charity workers. So you can see it's all a bit mixed up with these sorts of projects, really. I think Anna's spoken very well, earlier on about the potential in travel to be a sort of transformative experience for individuals, not for societies, but for individuals. That kind of sense of freedom, seeing something you've never seen before. But that was equally true of people who got on package holiday flights in the early 70s and went abroad for the first time. They might have been abroad to fight in a war, and landed on Calvi, Corsica, and hung out and drank. You know, there's no basis for having these moral and ethical divisions in different forms of tourism, in different forms of activity. It's moralising. It's not morality. It's really, really moralising. Therefore, the important thing, I think, is to celebrate the humanitarian impulse that people want to act upon and find ways to do that and affirm that. Celebrate the desire to travel and the increased ability of people to travel and to do that. But try and sort of strip that away from these instrumental agendas. You must be a global citizen. You must be an ethical tourist. You must put something back on your holidays. And that's really, really kind of important. Finally, I mean, I'll finally believe that tourism and lifestyle in the way we've been talking about it is less moralised when Harold is prepared to give a responsible tourism award to Ryanair.
Interestingly, Jim, you may not have to wait that long. Unfortunately, they've not applied, but we have given responsible tourism awards, for example, to TUI's charters because the carbon that they pump out the back of the plane per passenger mile is better than anybody else's who applies in a particular year. Perhaps you could encourage Ryanair to apply.
Believe it or not, the volunteer tourism area is something which is being written about and discussed in many different arenas. It explores a whole range of different things, from the issue of development and what does development mean, to the fact that people are consuming a product but actually meeting the people that are involved in that product through travelling to a particular destination, ideas of citizenship. So if people are interested in this, there's a lot of material out there and a lot of research coming out, reasonably accessible, very interesting to read, which throws up a lot of the debates which are continued in other areas, actually, as you rightly say, within the weekend as a whole. So if we could thank our speakers, please. Thank you.